Good morning, and thank you for joining me on this webinar about moving in, moving out, and signing a lease. This is part of a series of webinars that the City of Albany is hosting called the Good Neighbor School. My name is Danielle Smith, and I am the City of Albany's Good Neighbor School facilitator, as well as the city's housing services advocate. Before we get into today's presentation, for anyone who's newer to Zoom, you'll notice either at the top or the bottom of your screen, there should be a control bar. You'll notice that there should be a Q&A feature. You're welcome to use that throughout the presentation to ask any questions that you may have, and I'll be pausing periodically to address any questions that arise. You're also welcome to use the chat feature if you're more familiar with that as well. My contact information will be at the back of this presentation, so if you have anything you'd like to connect about offline, or if you have any suggestions for future programming, we would love to hear from you. So that's another option as well, of course. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started with today's presentation, moving and signing a lease. So first of all, to define what a lease is basically an agreement between a landlord and a tenant that sets the length of the rental term, so how long the tenant will be living there, and it also sets the terms and conditions, so basically your expectations for that rental term. A rental term is often we see for a year-long period, but it really could depend. It could be for 2 years, it could be for 6 months, or it could even be a month-to-month lease. Your lease agreement could be written or oral or a verbal lease. However, we would always recommend a written lease. This is going to be preferred because it's usually more enforceable. It's always helpful as well in case of any disagreements between the landlord and a tenant to have a written lease to refer back to, as well as just if you are 6 months into your lease and you forget maybe what your landlord's policy was on something, you would be able to go back and refer to what's outlined in the lease to answer any questions that you might have as well. So as a renter, why is it so important to read and understand your lease before you sign it? So a lot of the times what we may not realize is that a lease is a legally binding document as soon as we understand it. So it's really, really important that we read and understand every single page of the lease and every part of the lease that we're signing. Reading and understanding our lease before we sign it can help keep us from running into problems because you could actually be violating your lease without even knowing it. For example, if you didn't read your lease all the way through and you adopted a cat without realizing that your lease says no pets, you could be violating your lease without even realizing it. And again, as I mentioned before, if you have questions during your rental term, you would often find answers to those in your lease document. It's a good way to just be able to go back and refer to that and make sure that you're staying in compliance with the terms of your lease. Another reason to read the lease is to make sure that there is no language in there that is going to be violating your rights under the Fair Housing Act or your rights as a tenant in New York State. So your landlord should not be asking you to sign a lease that violates your rights, but sometimes, unfortunately, that does happen. So you'll want to be on the lookout for statements such as these. These are some examples of real illegal lease statements that we've seen from landlords in Albany. This property is being rented as is. You are not allowed to bring any children into the unit. I waive my rights as a tenant under New York state law. All housing complaints should be made to the landlord. Reporting a complaint to any other source may result in penalties to you. Or if I do not pay rent, my landlord can lock me out after 1 week. So statements like that, anything that sounds like it might violate your rights as a tenant, even if it sounds suspicious, please do reach out to someone, whether that's Legal Aid or United Tenants or even our office, just to get some clarification on whether or not that's allowed. So what do you do if you encounter statements like these in your lease? So if you do find a statement like one of the ones listed in the last slide on your lease, you can try bringing that up with a prospective landlord. A lot of the times what a landlord might do, especially if maybe they're not the most experienced, maybe they just live in the unit and they are just renting out like a spare room or the unit upstairs. Sometimes they may have downloaded a lease online and didn't realize that there was language in there that was actually against the law. And they may be willing to accept their mistake and change the lease. And if that's the case, then problem solved. However, if the landlord does not change the document, they're not willing to do that, then you as a tenant might want to consider whether you truly want to rent from this person. So what is contained in a lease? So the anatomy of a lease, the lease would usually contain some really important information for you as a tenant to have. So it would contain the owner's name and contact information. As a tenant, that's really good to know in case you need to reach the owner for any repairs. It usually also will contain information about how you would pay rent and how much rent is due. It would include the tenant's names as well as the authorized occupant, so anyone else who's allowed to live there full time. The premises, so the unit address. As I said before, the length term of the lease, your security deposit amount and what the policy will be like for returning your security deposit, your landlord's policies surrounding utilities, things like garbage pickup, keys and locks, pet policy, whether or not pets are allowed, your landlord's maintenance and repair policy, entry and privacy, so that would concern when your landlord's allowed to enter the property. So a lot of the times tenants may think that they have a right to prevent their landlord from entering the property, and that's actually not true. A lot of the times in a lease, it actually does say that a landlord is allowed to enter the property to do things like repairs or to show to another tenant, provided they've given proper notice under New York state law, which is 24 hours. So a tenant may not realize this, and they could actually be violating their lease and putting themselves at risk for eviction if they prevent their landlord from entering. So that's really important as well. Fire or damage clause, so that usually discusses what would happen if there was severe damage to the unit. A lead disclosure, that's required by federal law. So if the landlord is aware of lead-based paint hazards in the unit, they have to tell you. If they are not aware of any hazards, then they have to tell you that they are not aware of any hazards as well. A lease violation policy, so basically an explanation of what would happen if you were to break the lease or if you were to violate any of the terms. And then an end of lease procedure, so basically how much notice a landlord is required to give you if they choose not to renew your lease, and vice versa, how much notice you would have to give your landlord if you decided not to renew your lease, and then both parties would sign it. So there are some questions that a tenant should be able to answer once you have signed your lease, ideally before you've signed your lease, but these are things that you should be able to answer based on your lease document. So you should be able to answer when your lease ends, when the rent is due, where and how you pay your rent, whether there's a late rent fee and what that is. You should know what your security deposit amount is and how you would get that back. You should know which utilities you're responsible for. You should be aware of your landlord's pet policies. You should be aware of policies for visitors and guests. So some landlords do limit the number of guests or how long guests can stay. You should be aware of what would happen if you did need to move out before the lease is up, so breaking your lease. You should be aware of what condition the apartment would need to be in when you move out. You should have a pretty good idea of how you would go about requesting repairs or maintenance. And as I touched on before, you should know when your landlord is allowed to enter the apartment and how they would notify you of that. Let's go ahead and pause for a minute if there's any questions about reading a lease or what's in a lease. All right. So while we're on the topic of leases, which is a really important legal document that you need to read thoroughly, you should absolutely keep a copy throughout your rental term. There are also some other documents that you should keep throughout your rental term to protect yourself as well. So this is basically going to be an introduction to the types of records that you should keep as a as a renter. So why is it important that you keep good records as a renter? Um, Really, part of being a successful renter is keeping these important documents in a safe place, keeping them organized. And as I said, the reason for this is that it does protect you as a tenant in the event of any disputes or disagreements with your landlord. So unfortunately, sometimes these situations do arise that may prompt you to get into a disagreement with your landlord. And in some situations, these may even involve legal action. So keeping good records will help to ensure that you are protected, even if it does escalate to that level. So what types of records should we be keeping? So as I said, of course, you would want to keep a copy of your signed lease. That's just a good document to have for reference, as well as to have for to have a good idea of your policies that you've signed and make sure that you're not violating the lease. You'd also want to keep a copy of your rental application, photos from the unit from when you moved in, along with a rental condition checklist. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Utility statements, request for repairs. We'll talk about that as well. Copies of any written communication. And I always do advocate for communicating with your landlord in writing whenever possible. Again, just because then you do have proof of your communications, as opposed to when you've had a verbal communication, you can't necessarily prove what was said. Rent receipts, we'll discuss that a bit more as well. Your renter's insurance policy, and I always do recommend that people get renter's insurance. It is only a few dollars a month, and it does protect your belongings when your landlord's insurance does not. So if there's a fire at your apartment, most of the time your landlord's insurance is not going to cover the cost of your belongings, and those are worth more than you think. So it really is a good idea for your peace of mind to go ahead and get a renter's insurance policy. And then finally, your end of tenancy notice, which we'll talk about as well. So the items that are in bold are actually available as well for download. There are sample templates available for download from the City of Albany's website. And there will be a link at the end of this presentation to download those as well. So a rent receipt is a document that provides the proof that you have paid rent to your landlord or your property manager. So in New York State, every tenant has the right to request a rent receipt in writing from their landlord at any time. Once you've requested it once, your landlord is supposed to continue to give you a rent receipt every time you pay rent for the duration of your lease. And you should keep these rent receipts to prove your residency as well as your rent paid on the unit. So what does a rent receipt look like? So it should include the date the rent was paid and the amount, the address of the unit that you paid rent for, the time period of the rent that the rent was paid for, the signature and title of the person receiving the rent, so your landlord, as well as the name of the person receiving the rent. And the photo there at the bottom is just a picture of a simple rent receipt. It could really look like anything you want as long as it has that information. And again, your landlord is required to provide you with a rent receipt for rent paid, as long as you ask them for that under New York state law. A rental condition checklist is another really good idea to protect yourself when you move in, as well as when you move out, and to help you get your security deposit back. So before you move in or shortly after you move in, really as shortly as soon after you move in as possible, you and your landlord should do a detailed walkthrough inspection of the unit. You can use what's called a rental condition checklist to help you do that. And really every adult tenant in the unit should do one themselves. So there's a couple reasons why you should do this. So the first is that if there are any issues in the unit that need to be addressed, this lets the landlord know that these issues are present and now they have sort of a to-do list of things that need to be fixed in the unit. However, even if they don't fix those items, it also helps to make sure that you get your security deposit back when you move out, because you would be able to prove that those damages were present when you moved in. So this is the first page of the sample rental condition checklist that we have available to download on the City of Albany's website. I won't go through the whole thing just in the interest of time, but you can see it goes through sort of the interior surfaces, your doors, knobs, and locks, windows, screens, and blinds, because those can often be damaged when you move in. You would go through sort of just what's the situation with the floors and the carpeting. Are there any stains or scuffs on the floors when you move in? And generally just what's the condition of the property at the time that you move in. You could rate it on a 1 to 5 scale and then add any comments. And then when you move out, you would do the opposite. Go back through and add any comments again when you move out. And this just helps to ensure that you can get your deposit back, because you would be able to show that those damages were present when you moved in. So a couple of tips for completing this. I would definitely suggest when you do complete the rental condition checklist to take pictures as you go along, especially if there are any damages to the unit. So if there's, for example, a big stain on the carpet or a really big scuff on the wall, take a picture of that. And you can even add a timestamp to the photo or print it out and write the date on the back. And then you can keep those pictures with your rental condition checklist. And then that way, when you move out, you'll have it already and you'll be able to show that those damages were present when you moved in. Written repair requests. So again, I've talked a little bit about why it's a good idea to communicate with your landlord in writing. But the same goes for requesting repairs. So requesting your repairs in writing helps document your efforts as a tenant to communicate with your landlord. It shows that you have exercised your due diligence and that you've tried to communicate properly with them. Before maybe you have to escalate to any future steps, such as contacting code enforcement, it's a good idea to at least give your landlord the benefit of the doubt and give them an opportunity to make the repairs themselves. So again, we do have a sample repair request form available to download from the City of Albany's website, and it looks like this. So it would just include the tenant's name and the address of the property, the date of the request, whether or not it's the first request for repair, a brief description of the work done. You also could give your landlord an idea of when it might be convenient for you to have the work done, a way to contact you, and then your signature. Pretty simple. Any questions about documentation, record keeping, anything like that? All right, and finally, a moving out, moving in checklist. So once you've found your new place and signed a lease, you'll need to get ready to move. So the first step would be to notify your current landlord of the date you will move out. Again, we do have a sample end of tenancy notice on the City of Albany's website available for download. Depending on the terms of your lease, it may say you have to give 30 or 60 days notice to your current landlord of when you will be moving out, or else they could charge you like an extra month's rent. So you'll just want to pay attention to that. Number 2, collect clean boxes or containers for your upcoming move. So this is important because especially if you've had any pest issues, which is common in Albany, a lot of our housing is older. You'll want to make sure that you don't bring any pests into your new apartments. So it's a good idea to just buy some new plastic bins or some new boxes, cardboard boxes, containers for your new move. Number 3, you'll want to share your address with anyone who needs to know, especially your current landlord. This is important so they can return your security deposit. You'd also want to inform friends and family, your employer, so they can give you your documents at the end of the year, your bank and credit card company, so you can get your statements, your utility service providers, as well as any subscription services you use so you can get your billing correct. Number 4, complete a change of address form within the United States Postal Service office. And you can also complete this form for free at United States Postal Service location. So this is a way of having your mail forwarded from one address to another. As I said, you can do this for free or you can do it online. They just charge $1 or $2 fee to verify your identity. And it does last for several months, and then it just helps make sure that you're not losing any important mail between your addresses. Number 5, contact your utility provider or your landlord if your landlord provides your utilities about starting and stopping service. And if you do use National Grid, you are able to use their online service disconnect or transfer form. Number 6, perform any minor repairs that might help you get your deposit back. So there are some repairs that tenants are responsible for or otherwise may be able to do themselves just to help you get a little bit more of your deposit back. So for example, maybe you put up some shelves and now there's some holes in the drywall. You could actually patch and paint over those so that the holes wouldn't be noticeable to prevent those from being deducted from your deposit. Tenants are generally also responsible for replacing smoke detector batteries, light bulbs, things like that. And you'd also want to replace any knobs or fixtures that you switched out during your tenancy. Number 7, clean the unit thoroughly. So you'll want to make sure that you're hitting the bathrooms, bedrooms, kitchen, any other living spaces, your patio or balcony, and appliances. And one other thing is that a lot of landlords do require tenants to defrost the freezer. So I would check with your landlord about this, or again, see if there's anything in your lease that requires you to defrost the freezer before you move out. And then number 8, give the unit a final once over before you move out. Make sure you didn't forget any belongings or forget to clean something, just so you don't get any surprise charges after you've moved out. Number 9, getting to the final steps, you would want to complete a final walkthrough inspection with your landlord. So under New York state law, tenants do have a right to do a final walkthrough with their landlord if you ask them. And they do have to point out any damages that they are planning on deducting from your security deposit. They have to give you a chance to repair those damages first. So this is really important. If you are with your landlord and they point out maybe a stain on the wall, they might charge you $300 to repaint the entire room, but you may be able to repaint that yourself for a $10 can of paint and save yourself some money. So that's a really good thing to keep in mind, is that your landlord does need to do a final walkthrough with you if you ask, and they have to give you a chance to repair any damages yourself before they deduct them. And then finally, return your keys to the landlord, whether that's your house keys, mailbox keys, any other items that you have as well that belong to them. Any questions there? All right. So with that, that concludes our presentation today, moving and signing a lease. So there will be another session of this webinar today at 4 p.m. Other upcoming webinars will include tenants' rights next Wednesday, December 29th at 4 p.m. That webinar will cover basic tenants' rights for tenants in New York State and in Albany specifically. We will be covering the Albany Tenants Bill of Rights, good cause eviction legislation, as well as basic code education and some other topics. Legal processes and protections for tenants will be held on Thursday, December 30th at 4 p.m. And that webinar will cover just basic introduction to the civil legal process in Albany, as well as what the eviction process looks like and how a tenant can file a housing lawsuit if that's something they feel they need to do. And finally, this is my contact information. So if you feel like you have extra questions or if you need help with anything, please do feel free to reach out. My email address is the best way to reach me. It's dsmith@albanyny.gov. You can also reach me by phone at 518-694-0066. And the companion website to this module is albanyny.gov/1945/signing-a-lease. And again, you can download a lot of the forms and documents that we discussed throughout this workshop. Those are available to download for free, and a lot of this information is included there for reference as well. So with that, that's all we have for today. Thank you so much for joining, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your morning and afternoon. Thank you.